Start? Okay, so good morning, everyone, and welcome to the one of the opening sessions of the Net at Work conference. For those of you who perhaps need a small introduction, Net at Work is put together by the Martin Center, the political foundation of the European People's Party, and what they do is that they bring in the research and the expertise from all their member foundations across Europe who discuss in thematic sessions some of the things that each of these foundations is quite working on and quite interested in. So it's actually a unique opportunity to see a lot of different insights coming to Brussels and discussing issues of European interest. This session is sponsored by the Hjalmarsson Foundation, which is the Swedish member foundation of the Martin Center, and the topic is political corruption. My name is Angelos Chrysogelos. I'm a research associate of the Martin Center. I come from Greece, so I don't know if there's a Freudian kind of thing, like putting a Greek person on a Swedish panel to discuss corruption, but I'm sure that it's completely coincidental. So it is, of course, it's very common to say that the topic of my panel, whatever the topic is very topical, but actually this specific topic today, actually this week, is very, very topical. And the kind of expertise that we have here will be talking about political corruption and particularly on kind of high levels and of a transnational nature that is becoming increasingly important for European politics. So we have a lot of expertise represented, and I will introduce them in a moment, but hopefully we're not only going to learn something about political corruption in Europe and how it operates, but I would encourage all our panelists to also move a bit forward in the thinking and kind of also offer specific ideas and suggestions about what we can do about this topic. And then, of course, we're very happy to receive opinions from the audience. Our panel is going to proceed like a theater play or a Greek tragedy, however you want. So we're actually going to have a kickoff from John Dalhuisen, who is a former special advisor to the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights and former director for Europe and Central Asia at Amnesty International. So he has quite a lot of experience on this topic. And only last week, he was in Strasbourg, where he discussed and received insights, and I'm sure he's more than happy to share them here with us, about the ongoing saga that is happening with corruption in the political parliamentary assembly of the Council of Europe. Then we're going to hear from Alexander Stiegelmeier, who is Secretary General, Senior Analyst, and Editor at the European Stability Initiative. Alexander has extensive experience in various parts of broader Europe, if you will, and she has also been deeply involved in research on, and if you will, bringing up what has been described as one of the major scandals, corruption cases in the Council of Europe. So we will be very, very interested in hearing what it is that you found, perhaps even how you found it, and therefore how we can continue uncovering this kind of things. And then, as by means of kind of a general assessment and perhaps bridging with broader political context and what we can do about the problem of corruption, Ambassador Erik Rona, who is the Consul General of Sweden to the Åland Islands, he also has long experience in the higher echelons of political power, working very close with Carl Bildt, both as Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, and also the Martin Center is very lucky to have Erik Rona in its academic council. So, without further ado, we're going to start with John. Each speaker will be taking the podium, if that's okay with you, and speak for around 15 minutes max, perhaps. Hopefully, I will be signaling you in very kind of awkward ways once.
Right, is this working? Very good. Well, thank you very much. Welcome all of you. Thank you to the Wilfred Martin Center and Associated Foundations for this invitation to talk about this important issue. It is a much talked about issue, and it's very hard to tell you something, therefore, that you you don't know or haven't thought. But if I manage to do at least one of those things somewhere in the next 10 to 15 minutes, then I'd be delighted. Corruption, obviously, it's as old as government itself, and I think there was ever a political Eden in which this didn't exist, and certainly within the EU, we've all lived with it for a very long time. But it's now perhaps arising in a different kind of context, or there is a context that places the corruption that's taking place in a different light. And that is essentially the rise of illiberal forces and political parties that are changing the landscape in Europe, the political landscape, and threatening, I think fairly straightforwardly, European cohesion, core values, and the political dominance of traditional mainstream parties. And I think it's possible to distinguish between threats from within the EU and threats from without, from this ill wind that is blowing. The threats from without, obviously, are authoritarian, illiberal democracies that are now interwoven into the kind of the political fabric of a greater Europe. And certainly one of the places in which they are is the Council of Europe. But indeed, more broadly, economically, politically, in an increasingly globalized world, we're engaged in this huge game of influence that is ideological, that takes place at the battle of ideas, but certainly also financial, industrial, and economic. And then there are the threats from within, the rise of, let's call them populist parties, the advocates of illiberal democracy, which will lead, I think, fairly inevitably not just to illiberal democracy, but illiberal autocracy. So I think the central theme of what I want to talk about is the nexus between values and corruption. And to suggest that the corruption that we're seeing is really only a symptom of a broader crisis, perhaps a broader conflict of values, and a disinvestment in those values in key areas. And that tackling the corruption alone and just trying to subtract the corruption and see that as something you can tackle is really only a sticking plaster to a bigger and broader problem. But let me start by talking about the corruption scandal at the Council of Europe, around which allegations have swirled for years before they erupted at the end of last year, prompting this inquiry, the conclusions of which were published on Sunday. Alexandra will no doubt give many more details on this issue, and I'm going to just trace very much the broad outlines. But in a nutshell, a member state, Azerbaijan, set out over a number of years, very systematically, to capture a Council of Europe institution, its parliamentary assembly, with the aim of influencing its reporting on Azerbaijan, critically on election monitoring and political prisoners, two key value issues. And it secured, indeed, very favorable outcomes by targeting key individuals in the assembly, influencing appointments to key posts, most dramatically symbolized, indeed, in the person of Pedro Agramunt, the Spanish Partido Popular member, president of EPP in PACE at the time, then PACE president, accused of arriving in these positions through a variety of corruptive activities. I quote, "The investigation body notes, on the basis of all the evidence before it, that there are strong suspicions that corruptive activities to which Mr. Agramunt was a party played a role in his appointment as president of the EPP in PACE." He is really the tip of a fairly dirty iceberg. And Alexandra can explain the mechanisms through which this took place. But what are the key conclusions? There are essentially three. That a country, Azerbaijan, had a system for corrupting the Council of Europe. Gifts, lobbying, outright financial corruption, one. A state as system deliberately set out to undermine an institution. Two, it succeeded. It worked. It was enormously easy for Azerbaijan to do this. And that begs a number of important questions. And it did it for years, thirdly, despite a whole lot of people knowing about it. And Alexandra will then talk about that in more detail. Everyone kind of knew, from the civil servant to an NGO scene to the political parties assembled, other parliamentarians, and indeed the parties themselves. Everyone kind of knew that this was going on. So what conclusions do you draw? How is this allowed to take place? I think first, there's a real threat to the integrity of an institution that is central to upholding values in Europe at a time when the upholding of those values is itself an increasingly crucial task. And the ease with which this corruption was able to take place essentially is the product of a massive underinvestment in or attention given to these values and to this institution across the board by governments, by political parties, political groups, and I would even say over time, the civil society organizations that I've been a representative of. And in the end, this was only tackled when a relatively small group of individual parliamentarians stood up and said, something isn't right here, something very significant isn't right here, and we're going to try and do something about it. So how does this get tackled? What the next steps need to be? The report itself of the investigative body focuses in some detail on reforms to rules and procedures, appointments, voting systems, and all the rest, and I think this is really the least of it. I suspect these will be pushed through, but that's not really, I think, the main point. I think there are a number of others that in the end will be more important. And they all revolve around fundamentally taking the institutions and the values it's there to uphold seriously. So this requires some national parliamentary delegations, so national parties, to take it seriously, to put serious people in Strasbourg, and with the greatest of respect to the honourable exceptions and the appropriate lack of respect to the vast majority of parliamentarians that turn up in Strasbourg. You know, it's a basket of the second-rate, the put out to pasture. It's clearly not, and I say as someone who spent 6 years of my life there, particularly either committed, dare I say it, even necessarily intelligent, and certainly not influential MPs that are turning up there. And that reflects a culture indeed at a national level. In relation to specific allegations, and they go quite far, there must indeed be consequences at a national level within national parliaments, political parties, and in some instances criminal investigations. I think there are question marks for political groups to take this seriously. This was perhaps found more fertile ground within the EPP, but certainly not exclusively. By no means. This was a cross-party operation going on, and again, taking that leadership seriously within the central mechanisms of party political groups, I think is important. Then I come to the last 2 points. One is Azerbaijan itself. How do you deal with the fact that a state has set out systematically to undermine an institution? The investigation and much of the discussion so far is focused on the corrupted and not the corruptor. Indeed, the investigation didn't necessarily focus on the system and acknowledged that it wasn't really doing that and didn't draw firm conclusions that this was the case. But it's clear that there was this system. Which begs the question of what are the consequences. There must surely be, and this is then an issue that extends beyond the Parliamentary Assembly and individual parliamentarians, but crosses over into the intergovernmental level, consequences for Azerbaijan, possibly as a result of a further investigation into the systemic nature of these abuses. But then, what then? And I think there must eventually be quite serious questions about membership of Azerbaijan in this forum. Which in turn, I think, leads on to a final point on this part, which then I'll drift off to, if I've got a little bit of time left to reflect on some issues within the EU. The role of the Council of Europe itself, this institution that is supposed to defend, and at this particularly important moment, the rule of law, democracy, human rights, the guarantor of these things that are increasingly under threat, which was effectively repurposed 30 years ago to become an advisory, assisting system for the inevitable march and progress towards democracy of all its new member states, and it flipped its role. And it became a geopolitical project for creating a family of pan-European family of values which required only assistance and advice to be reached. And it has gone as far as that project could go. I don't want to say that that project failed. I think it had notable successes. But at a certain point, it's finished. But conceptually, that's still what the Council of Europe does. Within, that's how they think about it. That's how governments think about it. But I think it's now increasingly obvious that the Council of Europe can't be, or needs to radically change if it wants to remain, a family, a pan-European family of values. It can be a pan-European family without values. Or it can keep the values, and then it's not a pan-European family because there are a number of people who are not part of that family. And that's the choice, I think, the question that needs to be asked, and the choice that needs to be made. Because I think in the end, the defining of value, which I think is increasingly important internally within old Europe, is only done by signaling that these values have content, and that is only done by signaling that their breach has consequence. And that, I think, is a fundamental question. But I was invited also to reflect a little bit more broadly on political corruption also within the EU, and I'll do that in a few brief words, I hope. But again, reflecting on this nexus between corruption and value and the threat of illiberal forces. It is indeed a commonplace, a common assumption that corruption, political corruption, is a key driver of popular disaffection with politics, driver of populist movements. And no doubt this is true. And I'll just give a couple of quick quotes from the 2014 Commission report on corruption in the EU. The first and last of its kind, because the one that was supposed to come 2 years later was dropped for reasons that's perhaps not my place to dwell on, but are perhaps not insignificant. EU member states have in place most of the necessary legal instruments and institutions to prevent and fight corruption. Very good. However, the results they deliver are not satisfactory across the EU. Anti-corruption rules are not always vigorously enforced, systemic problems are not tackled effectively enough, and the relevant institutions do not always have sufficient capacity to enforce the rules. Declared intentions are still too distant from concrete results, and genuine political will to eradicate corruption often appears to be missing. And then on the political corruption in particular, codes of conduct within political parties or elected assemblies at central or local level are the exception more than the rule. They certainly were at the Council of Europe. Particular difficulties that arise across the board stem from the scarce and weak sanctions applicable to elected officials. Where they cover conflict of interest, the codes of conduct of various elected officials are usually not accompanied by dissuasive sanctions. Party discipline and self-control may not be sufficiently effective in this regard. Perhaps this is why there wasn't a second report. And I don't think very much has changed in relation to that assessment. But then let's look at some of the assumptions behind the corruption, an assumption of a rise of corruption, an assumption of a perception of a rise of assumption, and that link to the rise of populist parties. How long have I got? 2 minutes. Okay, well, I'll abridge, and then maybe I'll come back to some of the facts and figures. But what I wanted to, the conclusion I wanted to dwell on was an asymmetry in corruption by populist parties and by a political mainstream, and the difference in narrative, because there is a huge amount of tolerance for corruption by the strong man who protects the little man. So what is a killer for mainstream parties is the narrative. Corruption that is taking place by people who are presentable as a globalized, remote, distant elite. That is what is toxic. Corruption by the likes of the Erdogans, the Putins, conceivably the establishment around Mr. Orban. These are hugely forgivable in the eyes of a populace that is voting them into power for something else, to protect their values, their identity. So this asymmetry in the political consequence of corruption, I think, is hugely significant. And no one should be making assumptions that, well, the corruption that you can see in populist movements, like Cinque Stelle as well in Rome, I mean, it's a total debacle, doesn't hurt in the same way. And again, so I come back to the conclusion that the key aspect of combating corruption and combating the forces, the illiberal forces that arise on the back of corruption and perpetuate corruption, is through a contrary narrative, a narrative that reinforces values of rule of law, democracy, rights, and shows that these things can provide solutions to people's problems. Because otherwise the narrative of the illiberal autocrat that wins, irrespective of whatever corruption that they may themselves be involved in. And there are various numbers and all the rest of it, but I'll leave it with that thought and not abuse my time.
No, sure.
There you go.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you so much, John. It's actually a very dense speech. There's so lots of stuff that we have to makes us think about. So, corruption within a context of transnational party politics, such as the Council of Europe. What kind of people are being sent from a national level to the international, supranational level to represent their countries? Are perhaps normal avenues of mechanisms of control, accountability loosened, where people travel to Strasbourg? The nexus between corruption and values, and therefore illiberalism, as you said. Usually the media or the people are find it way too easy to forgive colorful leaders for corruption, but when mainstream parties get entangled in it, it just feels, it's so much more difficult for them to escape a negative narrative, and then also some discussion about the Council of Europe. So a lot of stuff, and also the relationship between, I guess, also the EU and the wider Europe as well. Lots of interesting stuff to think about also during Q&A. Alexandra, now, the floor is yours. Perhaps I think we can hear a bit more from the horse's mouth, so really kind of the goings-on in perhaps the Council of Europe, or the way that, give us an illustration about how perhaps those mechanisms of corruption work in practice.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
Thank you.
So I would like the Jarl Hjalmarsson Foundation to invite me here and to contribute to this conference, and also to John for having given me a very good introduction to my speech, or what I want to say. So we've talked about the Council of Europe, and I can only underline what John has said, that it is a very important organization. It has become irrelevant. It was not neglected for many years, but it is the only intergovernmental organization in Europe that is devoted to values, to human rights, rule of law, and democracy. It was founded in 1949 by people who went through the Second World War, like Winston Churchill, with the goal in their mind to have a watchdog over what happens in the member states, to tell each other how to improve their democracies, how to improve rule of law. And today, I think it would be more important than ever to return the Council of Europe to what it should be, a watchdog, a place where serious discussions take place, and also as a force against the rise of illiberalism in the EU. Now, until recently, the Council of Europe was fully captured by Azerbaijan and other authoritarian countries, and this battle is not won yet. We've made a big step forward, but there's still a lot to do. And I will now tell you how this one case of Azerbaijan corrupting PACE members happened, so you have a concrete idea how this is done. So I work for an independent think tank that works on a variety of issues. And in 2007, we started working on Azerbaijan. And we quickly realized that the human rights situation was very disconcerting, that critics and opposition faced massive problems. And one of our first reports was about 2 bloggers who had been imprisoned and arrested because they had made a really funny video about a government press conference where the government representative was a donkey. And during our research, we of course looked at PACE and the Council of Europe. What kind of reports had they done about Azerbaijan? What did they criticize? What did they point out? After all, Azerbaijan had joined the Council of Europe in 2001 and was still under a monitoring regime. And we noticed something very strange. Up until 2005, the reports about the state of human rights, democracy, or elections in Azerbaijan were very critical, really hard-hitting. And then, from 2006 on, they've become benign. Uh, Reports of PACE stressed progress in the country, made excuses for shortcomings, elections were declared free and fair, and we were very surprised what had happened. And we found an explanation. Azerbaijan had stepped up its corruption campaign. We had a source within the Azerbaijani apparatus who told us how it was done. You kind of befriended PACE members, you gave them smaller presents, then bigger presents. You invited them to Azerbaijan to spend holidays in luxury hotels, and there were more presents. Carpets, very expensive mobile phones, watches, and caviar. The source told us that a standard present for the friends in PACE was half a kilo of Caspian caviar for each session of PACE, and there are 4 sessions per year. And having a few key people who were influential was enough, because Azerbaijan also had the support of some national delegations based on political lines. For example, all Russians always voted with Azerbaijan. The Turkish delegation overwhelmingly voted with them. Azerbaijan has had investments in Western Balkan countries, so many of those voted with them. And the key people that Azerbaijan befriended were influential. So each time when there was an important vote, when an important rapporteur was to be elected in a committee who would monitor Azerbaijan, or there was a vote on report on political prisoners or another issue, Azerbaijan would mobilize its friends, say, you have to come to the vote, you have to vote for this amendment or this or that, please ask all your friends to come. And they also came, and suddenly these the forces of evil had a majority. There were many good PACE members, and they knew what was going on. But they said like, oh, we just missed this vote, so many of us didn't come to this session or to this committee vote. And Azerbaijan managed to do it. One also has to see, PACE, because all PACE members are members of national parliaments, they are never all there for a session. There are 324 PACE members, and if like 150 to 200 show up for a session, this is already a lot. And of course, they don't come for all 5 days, they come only for 2 days and so on. So it's very easy to sneak in a few votes or appointments, elections of rapporteurs, and make sure that your lobby, your group has the majority. So in 2012, we then published our first report, which was called Caviar Diplomacy, How Azerbaijan Silenced the Council of Europe. And there was very little reaction. Azerbaijan accused us of working for the Armenian lobby, which was like kind of the standard line. There was a little bit of indignation in the Council of Europe, and that was it. And the human rights situation in Azerbaijan continued to deteriorate. In 2014, it held the chairmanship of the Council of Europe, and at the same time, it launched the biggest crackdown on civil society and opponents ever seen. It completely extinguished the possibility for independent NGOs to work. It arrested dozens of people, all the leaders of opposition movements and NGOs. It was really bad, and the Council of Europe didn't react. So let's forward fast to 2016 first. 2 years ago, the prosecutor's office in Milan started investigating Mr. Luca Volonté, who used to be the head of the EPP group in PACE from 2011 and 2013. Because it had found that Mr. Volonté, a foundation of his and one of his companies, had secretly received 2.4 million euros between 2012 and 2014, so coinciding with the time when he was the head of the EPP group in PACE. And the prosecutors also found correspondence between him and his Azerbaijani contact person, Elkan Suleimanov, who was also a PACE member. And it was very clear how they were scheming to influence important votes, one on political prisoner, one on the human rights situation in Azerbaijan. And today, Mr. Volonté is still being tried for corruption in Italy. We then wrote a report about this one case with all the juicy details, all the quotes from the correspondence between Volonté and Suleimanov. And we went to PACE members who we knew were friends, as well as other organizations, NGOs like Amnesty International, Transparency International, and said, like, this is the opportunity to force PACE to do something about it. And we launched a big campaign all together, really pushed hard. It was an uphill battle. Like, there were friends of Azerbaijan who opposed an investigation within PACE. As John mentioned, one of the leading figures was the president of PACE, Pedro Agramunt from the Spanish Partido Popular. Also, the head of the liberal group in PACE was against an investigation. His name was Jordi Huxla. Or also the head of the EPP group and head of the German delegation, Axel Fischer, didn't think it was necessary. They said, oh, it will just like ruin our reputation and the Italian authorities are dealing with it. But like the Sunshine Coalition in PACE, who had enough, was pushing, and they got the investigation. The Bureau, that's the 30-something member body who leads PACE, agreed to launch it. The next battle was then about the terms of reference for the investigation. And then something happened which really was not related to the corruption scandal, but helped it. Because Agramont Huxla and the third PACE member accepted an invitation by Russia to go to Syria, to travel to Damascus, and they also met with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. For the Russians and the Syrians, this was a huge PR success. There were many, many photos. And of course, when they came back, PACE members asked, what's that? Hello. And they had not announced this visit. And this basically contributed to Agramont, Huxla, and this whole group of high-level PACE members who opposed a hard investigation to lose influence. And in the coming months, PACE really cleaned up. They launched the investigation. It was a very good investigation. The terms of reference were good. It was headed by 3 well-respected judges with very, very good CVs. PACE changed its rules of procedures so it could get rid of Agramont, who refused to resign, although there were immediately calls after he had come back from Damascus. PACE before they could appoint a president, elect a president, but they could not de-elect them. So they changed the rules of procedure so they could dismiss them. And they also changed the code of conduct, who had been very weak and not enforced in any case, based on recommendation from GRECO, which is the Group of States Against Corruption, another very good group in the Council of Europe. And as John said, we now have the investigation report, which confirms more or less what we've said. It also adds a lot of detail. The investigation body, of course, didn't have any executive power. So whatever they found out was based on people coming to it and telling what they knew. So there were no confiscation of documents or so on. They were not authorized to do that. And what is now important is, of course, that national parliaments and national authorities follow up, because law enforcement agencies could confiscate material and could find real proof that people were involved in corruption. And I think this is very important because, as I said, we need the Council of Europe and we need to recapture it. And that requires, first of all, recapturing it from Azerbaijan, but then also from other countries. And one thing that the investigation body didn't do is it did not look at Azerbaijan's policy. It looked at what individual PACE members had done. But Azerbaijan's policy was systemic. And the question is it okay to be a member of the Council of Europe and completely outplay, outsmart, and cheat the organization? So I think there should be a separate investigation into the systemic nature of what Azerbaijan has done, and then also a conclusion. One would have to think, should Azerbaijan be punished? How can it be punished? You can suspend voting rights of the delegation PACE. You can suspend voting rights of the country in the Committee of Ministers, which is the ministerial political body leading the Council of Europe, or you can exclude it altogether. But I think if the Council of Europe lets Azerbaijan get away with what it has done, it will look ridiculous. Another question will, of course, be Russia, because Russia is also undermining the Council of Europe. They don't need to bribe anyone. They don't care about their image. But they stopped paying their membership contributions last year after PACE started cleaning up. And in the press release of the Foreign Ministry of Russia, it also clearly stated like, oh, there is a witch hunt against our friends in PACE. Russia passed legislation that allows its constitutional court to declare judgments by the European Court of Human Rights unconstitutional, and then Russia doesn't have to implement it. That's also clearly in violation of the statute. So that's the next question. But we think the Council of Europe has to deal with the questions because it had become a laughingstock. I mean, it had become irrelevant because it allowed such things. Because people, NGOs, saw what was going on in Azerbaijan, and then they read PACE reports that commended Azerbaijan for progress or free and fair elections. And yes.
If we can, I think we have more time to offer some, some assessment solutions in the Q&A.
Yes.
In the Q&A as well. So. If you can just conclude, then we can...
Yeah. So I will conclude by saying that the battle for the Council of Europe, for a strong Council of Europe, is not over yet. And there are many instances, national parliaments, political party groups, governments that still have a very important role to play. Okay.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. I think was very, very fascinating. I think what most of us are going to, the one piece of information all of us will remember leaving this room is that it's worth 500 grams of caviar per person per session to allow a government to keep political prisoners locked up, which I think is both funny and extremely, extremely sad at the same time.
That was just like one of the
many of course, but it really is kind of, it also shows you a bit the cynicism of the whole thing, you know, everything has a price list ultimately, but I also must congratulate you for the extremely important work, you know, kind of bringing these things forward, and of course, again, broader questions about the role of the Council of Europe, about the activities of authoritarian regimes taking advantage, basically, of structures that exist for democratic countries to discuss, for the democratic politicians, parliamentarians to defend European values, and then completely spinning the function of this thing to suit their own goals. And we can discuss implications of that later on. Olof Erekrona, we're looking forward to hearing your assessment or your ideas on this topic.
Thanks. I will be seated. Let me first thank you, ESI, and all human rights concerned persons who have worked on this case, because I think it's really an important case. It can be a turning point in a very, very disturbing process that we have seen in our institutional setup in the Western world for a number of years. And I think it's it has become increasingly important to define the concept of political corruption and to define what should be done in order to stop it. Because political corruption is a fairly new thing in our political environment. Corruption has been around us for always. And certain political cultures are corrupt, inherently corrupt. But what I mean with political corruption is slightly different. It's the way of systematically undermine the institutional setup in the open societies. It's to, with more or less intellectual violence, ruin the democratic institutional setup. The Council of Europe was created 1948 or 49. 49, after the Second World War. There were two main focus. It was human rights, but it was also rule of law. And it was after a period between the wars when the public opinion in many countries had been systematically manipulated by authoritarian regimes of various kinds. And if we look, for example, to Italy in the 20s and 30s, researchers say that Mussolini was not corrupt in the classical way. He was not bought. But he corrupted the political climate in Italy. And it was actually he who invented the concept of totalitarianism in a speech when he said that we are going to create a total fascist political environment in Italy. But still, with regard to money, Benito Mussolini was not a particular difficult case. If you saw in Germany how Germany used the then most modern technology in order to promote the ideas of Nazism. And the modern technology those days was, of course, radio. And they used radio communication systematically in order to indoctrinate the German people and manipulate their opinions. Based on these experiences, all of the Western world started to really think through how should the norms be in the political communication, and what should be the way that we looked upon political arguments, if they were true or not true, if they were false, if it was debatable, or if it was outright lies. This was a discussion we had all over the Western world based on political scientists, economists, etc. Everyone was discussing what should be the spontaneous order of a sound political debate and how to avoid manipulation. And in that spirit, we founded the Council of Europe. And the Council of Europe had both a formal task in order to look upon human rights and how the rule of law was operated among the member states. But it was also an institution that was based on a liberal, or say liberal conservative, or an open society intellectual concept. And this intellectual concept has been eroded gradually during the postmodern times. And what we are seeing is now the consequences of the vulgarization of many of the postmodern ideas. They have, in my view, made a mix-up, made a mess of the difference between ontology, that is, what is being, what is things really, and the epistemology, what can we know about things. They have made a mess up between those two concepts, and it has ended up in more or less total relativization of everything. And this is what we see in the discussion between Russia and the West. We see it in the way a series has been operating within the Council of Europe. You give some sort of legitimacy for not taking stand on issues like human rights, because there is always a whataboutism somewhere, a relativization there. Well, you are not better than we there. Well, you take bribes. You let us bribe you, give you presents. There is now time for delivery. And it's like a cancer. It's like a cancer in the institutional setup of the Western world. And from that reason, what you are doing is so extremely important when you ring the alarm bell and say, this is not okay. If you look at the intellectual base for the discussion between Russia and the rest of the world with regard to the taking down on the MH17, or if you look about the discussion between Russia and the Western world on the war in Ukraine, the Russian war with Ukraine, the Russian invasion in Ukraine, or if you look at the discussion of what has actually happened in Syria the last years. You see everywhere the same pattern. A fundamental erosion of the intellectual platform and the intellectual base for the open society. So there is a direct link between what we see from factual corruption, money, and the corruption of values and ideas in our own societies. Therefore, it is important to discuss things like anonymous ownership. Anonymous ownership was not a big problem in our societies until it was started to be used as a political tool. You could say that anonymous ownership could see it from an integrity perspective. And you could see it also from a competitive perspective. But now, when anonymous ownership has become a political tool, it's a different story. And I would say that where the political corruption has risen faster than anywhere else is actually in the Anglo-Saxon world right now. UK, in London, City of London. US, I will not dwell on that. But under the hidden roof of anonymous ownership, much can be done in the political context that should not be able to be done if there were total transparency. So I would say that the fact that we are now challenged by the authoritarian regimes and the illiberal regimes, the fact that we are challenged in the way we are makes it necessary for us to take more precaution than we used to with regard to this aspect. I'm economically a very liberal person, but I believe that we are now have crossed the line that we, in order to preserve the integrity of our political institutions, need more of transparency with regard to things like ownership. We must also know that there is a link between the very, very fast technological change and this problem. It is much easier now to manipulate people within the framework of the digital universe than it was when we only operated in an analog universe. In the analog universe, we had developed structures, formulas, rules in order to deal with these issues of intellectual honesty and intellectual transparency. In the digital universe, it's much more difficult, and we are still learning how to manage this, the digitalized information society. And we have a discussion, or we have development in two dimensions here. One is about money. When technology changes, there are a number of entrepreneurial profits. So we get enormous wealth among few persons who are very successful, and the rest is catching up much later. So we have a period where you got increased economic differences within the society. But it's also a question of information power. Information power is then placed on rather few hands. I mean, Facebook, Google, etc. And if those resources of information power is manipulated, the consequences will be disastrous for us all. This we must reflect upon. We need to have a balance between freedom in the digital universe and a rule of law and a law-based system. We must understand that we are still in learning mode when it comes to deal with these things. Now we are aware of the threats, we are aware of the attacks in a way that we were not 10 years ago, when social media was in practice non-existent, or was just in the beginning of their... but now we need to go through the same process as we did when we tried to manage the printing, the television, the radio, the telecommunications in general. And yeah, I will stop there.
No, one more minute.
Okay. Yeah. So it is a problem in many dimensions. And to a certain extent, maybe we should be glad that we have seen this problem of political corruption as early as we have, so we can take countermeasures. But I would say it starts with acknowledging the problem and with acknowledging the threat. And for that, we are very grateful for ESI and human rights concerned persons in the civil society.
Right, excellent. Thank you so much, Olaf Ehrenkrona. So you have located the problem that we heard about. So I think it's a nice way that kind of the focus of each of the speakers kind of touched on all the facets of a very multifaceted topic. So we heard about the political context within the Council of Europe, about how the problem of corruption interplays with questions of authoritarianism and illiberalism, and now you located it within the broader question of how our democracies work within a more complicated media landscape, within a more complicated digital landscape, and also within a more complicated landscape of economic regulations, and also important questions of transparency, secrecy, and all those things. So just a number of few and easy topics to talk about. So I will now open the floor for questions. We have a little bit less than half an hour for discussions. I would ask you, there's a mic going around, so you can speak through the mic. I would ask you to briefly introduce yourselves, your name and your affiliation. You're more than happy to offer a couple of sentences of thoughts, how you reflect on that, but please, as I said, we don't have much time, so the speeches come from panelists, not from the audience. So if you can move into your question to the members of the audience as soon as you can, that would be very appreciated. So questions. Well, so we'll start with the lady here in the second row.
Yes, hello. I think it's not, is it switched on? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. My name is Elisabeth Alteköster. I'm of German nationality. I used to work in the past, not for the Council of Europe, but the Council of the European Union, so of the ministers of the European Union. And I'm nowadays an active member of a Belgian party, Flemish party, the NVA. What I regret a little bit is that we are here losing, or I have the impression, losing an opportunity to talk about something which is mentioned in the title, that corruption is an increasing problem in the EU. We talk about Azerbaijan and Russia and the usual suspects, but what is going on inside the European Union? You talked about Mussolini, but I would like to recall that in the end of the 80s, begin 90s, in Italy, a whole government and a whole political system under the Prime Minister Bettino Craxi fell because of corruption. I mean, I don't want to pinpoint to a specific country of the European Union, but this corruption is still inherent in a lot of countries, also in Italy, even under Matteo Renzi, when they were in the run-up to organizing the worldwide exhibition in Milan. And although they had a lot of scanning commissions, there was a lot of corruption going on with regard to public procurement. And we still have a lot of corruption going on with regard to the use of funds, social funds, cohesion funds coming from the European Union. I mean, what would you recommend to the European Union and their institutions to do and to say to their member states in order to improve, to change? I mean, Greece is another story. Once you really fall on your nose, then you get a troika, and then you look into they look into your structural problems. But I mean, for the rest, the only thing we had up to now is from the Commission an anti-corruption report in 2014, and from time to time in the country-specific recommendations, annually, they mention this problem. But there is not, I think, not a sufficient effort to combat that.
Okay, all right, thank you. So, corruption in the EU, one topic. Roland, did you want to? So, we'll use the House prerogative for a moment. So.
Yeah, thanks, Angelos. I'm Roland Freudenstein, Policy Director of the Martin Center. And 3 brief points. I mean, first of all, congratulations to this panel in general, but especially, of course, to the European Stability Initiative for your work. I mean, this was a breathtaking, short rendering of your work, and I was really captured by it. So thanks for doing what you've been doing.
Thank you.
Second point, on Russia. You know, I think there is a dangerous temptation to classify every Putin-versteher as a corrupt person. And I'm the last one who would myself accept Putin verstehen, if you know what I've written and said over the last couple of years. But I think the bigger problem with Russia and Russia's influence and impact in our societies is still the non-corrupt one. Corruption is a factor, and of course Russia is trying to use it. And of course Russia is cynical about it, and you know, strangely accusing us of being even more cynical because we're allegedly hypocritical. We don't, you know, the Russian line would be everyone's corrupt, but you guys don't own up to it. But there are Putin-versteher, there are people who accept parts or the whole of the narrative of the Kremlin because they actually believe it. And they would do what they, even I would claim that even the people who do take money from Russia are people who would actually do the same thing, more or less, even if the Russians didn't pay them. Because they believe it's right. And we have to tackle them politically with arguments.
Third point, Roland. Third point, Roland.
Third point, coming. The modernization partnership with Russia was, of course, not only did we not succeed in modernizing Russia, but Russia actually succeeded in corrupting us. So not every project failed, you know. But what does that imply? Does that mean that we have to actually reduce our relationship with Russia? Because every economic relationship bears a high risk, if not probability, of corruption. What is the implication here?
Okay, excellent. And we'll take one more question. The gentleman on the 4th row over there. again, if you can be brief, that would be appreciated. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Miklos Györfi from the European Parliament. I am a research administrator in the European Parliament. I would like to join to the lady before me because indeed the issue is it's an increasing problem in the EU, whether it is increasing to what extent. Because corruption is present in the EU, as you said, from a long time. That's one point. And the second point is that indeed very useful to deal with issues like Azerbaijan and Russia, but what about certain member states which, in my opinion, they do present the classical, as you define, political corruption today. Now, I would refer to an exhibition which has been in the parliament some 2 months ago, which was done by a Romanian MEP, Monica Macovei, about the corruption in Romania, which is a political corruption. It is not simply a bribing issue. And perhaps you know, you are aware of the fact that currently in Romania, there is a huge struggle between the government and the anti-corruption which is a campaign against the anti-corruption prosecution, which is really undermining the values of the EU, because it tries to use and to misuse legal ways in the way of the legal state, the state of law, in order to institutionalize a systemic corruption in the country. I don't know what the Council of Europe is doing in this respect. I do not hear anything as an outcome. What I am following constantly is the Romanian press. I am originating from Romania, by the way. I am not a Romanian citizen right now. And it is highly intriguing what I can read, learn, and find out about this. Okay. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. We're going to take a turn now. We're going to follow the same line as we had before. So, corruption in the EU, corruption in the highest levels of political power in the EU. What can we do about it? Is it sometimes can political corruption on a national level actually use EU institutions to shelter itself? And also the question of and what can the EU do about it? And also the question of Russian influence. Is it only a question of corruption, or do we actually just see a sincere appeal of illiberal or semi-authoritarian governance in Europe? And also, ultimately, what do you do with the countries in Europe's periphery whose governments are using these methods, but at the same time, I suppose we need to be engaged with them in some sort of institutional setup to make sure that we can influence developments there in a more positive way. So if you can, all three of you following the same pattern, briefly touch upon these points, and then we can move on to another round of questions.
I mean, I was going to get it on a little bit to the EU. It's clearly still a very massive problem across the EU, and it's more than just arguable, I think, that people aren't doing quite enough about it. But I think it would also be untrue to say that people are doing less about it than they were 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. But I think this comes in gusts and bursts of enthusiasm that then die away. And I think, again, the reluctance to publish another report after 2014 is indicative of a sense that this isn't the issue of the moment within the EU. And I think this is fundamentally mistaken. I mean, the thing that is still published, the Eurobarometer on corruption perceptions, are revealing. I mean, 2/3 of Europeans think that corruption is widespread in their country. I mean, that's quite a significant stat. The most significant, the first public institution, number one in the perception of corruption, is political parties and political actors, above everything, and by quite some margin in a lot of countries. There are exceptions somewhere where it inverts. I think what's interesting, though, when one looks at it, you start breaking it down, is that there hasn't been, and people talk about this nexus between the rise of populist movements and corruption, they're inverted. Perceptions of corruption across Europe in the last 3-4 years, certainly since the first one, is generally downward. I mean, or rather, the rate at which people think it's getting worse is decreasing, which is a decrease, because everyone always thinks that corruption is bad or whatever happens. And there isn't necessarily a correlation between a sense of a rising perception of corruption and an increase in populist movements. Spain and Italy, it's the other way around, in fact, and perceptions of corruption are decreasing. Before, in fact, you've seen a rise of populist parties, but we'll see after tomorrow, after the next few weeks of conversation in Italy. But I think what a number of places are interesting. It's interesting to compare Poland and Hungary on this, and the rewards. Poland has seen a remarked decline in perceptions of corruption, very marked in the last 3 years, the most significant of any country. And it's clear that PiS has had a very significant electoral bounce on the back of this. It's seen a trembling of its support in recent months. Some people argue that this is linked in some way to emerging allegations of cronyism. But on the whole, I mean, even now they're cracking down on it within the party. So the electoral reward there of being perceived to have done something about it, to have cleaned up a system which is part of that narrative, is hugely rewarded. Now, Hungary, you see the reverse phenomenon. So perceptions of corruption in Hungary have gone up. And the perceptions of corruption by Fidesz have gone up. So a 2016 survey had 2/3 of Hungarians think that Fidesz is essentially corrupt, a party to a system of systemic corruption. Even, I can try and find the exact number, a significant proportion of its own voters, 1/3, agree with that assessment. But you don't see there an electoral blowback, because you can take the conversation somewhere else. And then it's the same with Trump. If you're trying to drain the swamp, it doesn't matter how much is going into your own pocket, because you're draining the swamp of something else. Essentially, well, most of the people sitting in this room, right, I take it that we are the Brussels swamp. I would include myself as part of that boggy mess. So it depends very much on narrative, and I think narrative brings me to the point about Russia, that there's something beyond it that is essentially ideological, and I think lots of us have come back to this point. I mean, apart from what the EU needs to do on the EU, the final point you might begin to contemplate, but actually when you suddenly work out how you would implement it, becomes very difficult in relation to existing powers and all the rest of it. But is there space for a EU anti-corruption agency with some supervisory powers over the use of its own funds, the monitoring of which is now entirely dependent on domestic mechanisms? I mean, in a lot of countries, I mean, the funds are spent in the countries with the highest levels of corruption. Where that is then allied with a political corruption which contaminates elements of the judiciary, which is a topic of discussion, shall we say, in a number of countries right now, the ability to then ensure the appropriate use of EU funds, so the collective EU taxpayer money, in a country in which there will be judicial protection for that abuse, I think is a very real question.
And if I may jump in, it's also interesting that in some countries in Europe, particularly in countries where, at least I can speak for Greece and Italy, kind of in the Mediterranean, people may not like the EU in recent years, but in most opinion polls, the EU is always scored as much better in perceptions of corruption than the national political system. People actually view the EU as, if anything else, as at least much less corrupt than their local political systems, which they know all too well, and they're quite familiar with how they're working. So, there's even space for the EU in terms of, for the proposal you just made, in kind of becoming a more prevalent player with regards to how money is being spent, or at least its own money, you should have a say over in those countries. So just to reinforce the point that you just made.
And then on Russia, I mean, the reality is that if a liberal democratic forces can make the central part of their agenda, a central part of their appeal to essentially the preservation of a demos coalescing around a national identity and traditional values, and that's what you're defending your demos against, and people who are part of your polis, the whole country, but not part of your demos, well, you can screw on them. That's okay. Can use corruption and are not affected by allegations of corruption against them. That's what I keep coming back to. And this is, I think, the case again of Russia and the combating of that. It's not, you can't come right, it's not, you know, these people don't fall on the swords of their own corrupt practices. They are sustained by the narrative, the political ideology they have that people find incredibly compelling, and people find it incredibly compelling far beyond just those countries. And that is, I think, the bigger danger. And the corruption is a symptom of that. And the inability to combat it is the inability to present an ideological opposition to that. And that's Europe's single biggest defining, I would say, weakness right now. And it's hugely manifest in the Council of Europe. But I don't think anyone should assume that the EU is immune. Or wider political movements in Europe are immune to that. They will be affected too.
Alexandra?
Yes, I think that political corruption can have two meanings. I mean, corruption to achieve political aims, like you give somebody caviar and wants that he votes for you, but also the corruption of our value system. And I'm talking more about that. I think this is the topic. I mean, of course, there is corruption with EU structural funds, but this is not an attack on our value system as something that Azerbaijan has done in the Council of Europe, or which also goes on in the EU. So I would also say that Russia, but then also Trump and many others have created a world, the post-truth world, where facts no longer count. No one cares about facts. I mean, there's a scandal in the White House every day. I mean, it's no scandal anymore. We don't care. He had prostitutes, he lied about this, so what? And I think this is what we need to fight. It also includes fighting, of course, things, real corruption, but it also includes identifying the subversive effect of illiberalism in the EU. And I know that in the context of the EPP, the Fidesz party is a difficult, sensitive topic, but you can see that some EPP leaders do have a certain degree of admiration for Viktor Orban. And you can analyze it, and you can see how he kind of slowly undermines our value system. Mainstream parties cannot use the same methods that he uses, because he does very plump-like, he creates a non-existing danger and then presents himself as the savior. Unfortunately, Hungarian people still this appeals to people. But here within Europe, I think we need more debate about what it is, what corrupts our politics, and how to react to it. I mean, in my opinion, of course, Fidesz shouldn't have a place in the EPP. They should go. And there are many little things that can be done by mainstream parties, which have to regain the trust of their people. And it also means upholding the old values who are still valid, even in today's world. Honesty, respect for the rule of law, respect for human rights, functioning democratic institutions, etc.
Yeah. I agree very much with what you said, Alexander. I think, was it Schiller who said that ideas are like the blizzard before the thunder? I think it was Schiller. Hegel had the same idea. Ideas comes before acting. And what I would say is that we have had for a number of years decades a deterioration of our intellectual standards in the West as a consequence of much of the vulgarization, I would say, from the postmodernism. And what is it about? Well, if you look at the concept of human rights, for example, it becomes more and more usual to say that human rights are, what's human rights? Some people even quote the masks and say, I never met a human, I met Portuguese and Scottish and French, but never a human. And they say that human rights cannot be universal because they are not founded in reality. You can always question them. It's metaphysics. This is and look at the popular, how popular Heidegger has been in the east of Europe and Russia, and it's his criticism of the Western civilization that actually is appealing in those countries. And if you look at the linkage or the ideal links between Ilyan's ideas in Russia in the early 20s and 30s and the present regime in Kremlin, you see clear similarities. And Ilyan was the founder of Russian fascism. He was ostracized by Lenin, who thought actually liked him, but he thought that Dzerzhinsky was a bit too harsh and threatened to put him or deport him to Siberia. So he ostracized him and sent him to Europe, where he turned up in various shapes. And this corruption of our values, I think there was a Finnish-Swedish philosopher, moral philosopher, Edvard Westermark, who published a very, very interesting thesis in early 20th century, where he said that we tend to find it moral acceptable what we like. He was a liberal critic of the theories of utilization, John Stuart Mill. He said that what we like, we tend also to find morally acceptable. And that is exactly what we now see. People who likes the ideas of Putin and people who likes the ideas of the alt-right, they also find them morally acceptable. And the big thing that we found out after those disastrous wars in the 20th century was actually that there are moral standards that are above what we like, or at least there should be such moral standards. And these are necessary to have in politics. So when you say, how do we fight? Well, the first thing is, of course, to fight corruption at home. I agree with you in that sense, because if we don't fight the corruption at home, we will become targets for corruption from abroad. And that is what happens in many of the southern European countries. As long as corruption was only a problem in Italy and in Greece, okay, it was an Italian and a Greek problem. But when it influences how they vote in the council on issues like the Russian sanctions, or what position shall we take if a European nation becomes invaded like Ukraine, then it becomes a wider problem. And what about the way that they sell citizenships in Malta, which gives them access to Schengen? As long as it only gives access to Malta, we might think it's not that big a problem if you have a number of Russian oligarchs being there. But if they get a free tour around all the Schengen area, it's a different thing. The banking system in Cyprus, we all know how they are working. And well, it's not only a problem for the EU, it's definitely a problem for the US, since the Minister of Trade was used to be Vice President of the Bank of Cyprus. So, yeah, there is a link between money and corruption of values, but the fight starts with fighting the corruption of values, I would say.
Right.
It's the shared conclusion.
Yeah, shared conclusion. Excellent. That's the best kind of conclusions. I'm conscious of the fact that there probably were some more questions from the audience, but I think you might agree with me that we had such an exciting panel with such a vibrant kind of exchange between practical information, what happens on the ground, so the nitty-gritty of corruption on the one hand, and some more kind of conceptual and idealistic, I would say, discussion about how all this thing fits in within the current state of democracy. I think it's actually a very, it was a very interesting exchange of ideas, and I think our perception of the topic has been enriched. I mean, I know that my perspective has been enriched on this topic. I would like to thank the Jarl Hjalmarsson Foundation for helping us put this panel together, and of course the Martin Center for hosting this excellent panel here in Brussels. I would like to thank all of you for coming here today. The Net at Work continues with more sessions throughout the day, so please do stay if you can. And and I think the last thing that remains for us to do is to thank our wonderful panel for the excellent insights that they provided to us.
It's always hard to applaud someone else without giving the impression that you're applauding yourself.